It's a pleasure for me to greet a faithful remnant here. Among so many distractions, you came, and I hope that you are blessed by the meetings this afternoon as well. And I hope that you liked also enjoyed our Ellen G. White report yesterday afternoon. The best one. Okay. So I should shorten mine as well here. Okay, amen. As it was mentioned by our friend Clinton, I chose an expression from Ellen White's writings, The Footsteps of Approaching God. And the topic is very broad. I was just asked to reflect on Ellen White's eschatology. So perhaps you might be frustrated of what I will be leaving out. You would expect something else and it's not there. But I hope that at least the remarks that we will make here can be helpful. And I would deal a little bit on the context also and a few distractions from the focus, but then to understand the relevance of Ellen White's contribution for eschatology. The winds of the Cold War were still blowing, and there was much fear and uncertainty about the future. In 1970, Hal Lindsey's book, The Late Great The Late Great Planet Earth was released, came off the press, and he was suggesting in his book that the United States would cease of leading the West. Russian Confederation would really become the power of the future, and no reference to the Vatican. Simply would not play any significant role in this context. Actually, some critics believe that he was the crucial person to develop what can be called the apocalypse industry. No wonder that some Seventh-day Adventists were tempted to incorporate some of Lindsey's views in their eschatological sketch. Yet, as time went by, the political influence of the Vatican increased significantly and even played a crucial role with the United States in the disruption of the former Soviet Union. It's interesting that in November 1978, a famous former Jesuit scholar by name Malachi Martin, remember November 78, less than a month after John Paul II became the Pope, he wrote and published an insightful article in the New York Daily Messenger, or Daily News, sorry. And the article was titled, How John Paul II, How He Will Surprise Us and the Reds. In this article, he was suggesting that John Paul II, coming from Poland, having experience in a communist country and also with capitalism, would try to undermine both of them. 12 years later, he published this book that has been very much referred to in our circles, The Keys of This Blood, and you have the subtitle, The Struggle for World Domination or Dominion between Pope John Paul II, Gorbachev, and Western capitalism. And Martin just confirmed what he had said in his article at the beginning. But it's interesting that more and more the world scenario was coming closer and closer to what Ellen White said. Martin said or suggested that the Vatican would undermine both communism and capitalism, but that was not the case. After the fall of the Berlin Wall and the formal dissolution of the Soviet Union, I went back and wrote a letter to Hal Lindsey. And in that letter, I asked him, you said that the United States would really go down and that the Soviet Union would be the power of the future. And now that the opposite took place, and the United States is the superpower today, could it be possible that you were mistaken in your interpretations? And that other ones, including Ellen White, were closer to what is taking place today? His secretary answered saying that he received the letter, but I never received the answer to my question. And probably I was expecting too much from him. In this article, or my presentation now, we will highlight 6 points. As I mentioned at the beginning, we could have included other ones, but I think that those are enough for our reflections. And here you have outline of the topics that we will cover. The first one, major end-time challenges. Then we will deal a little bit on the great controversy framework, and also the signs of the time of the end, the conditional imminence, end-time scenario, and then the final outcome. Let's start with the first one, major end-time challenges. Ellen White began her prophetic ministry in 1844, a crucial time when God and His Word were being severely challenged by humanistic ideologies. Coincidence or not, because many things took place in 1844, and we know we cannot say that everything was connected. We can have some coincidences, but perhaps not necessarily. We had 2 major, very influential people on the scene. And one of those, Charles Darwin. In 1844, he finished, or better saying, he actually wrote or came to the conclusion for his sketch of the species theory by natural selection. And he even wrote to his own wife about this. I finally finished my sketch and now it's basically in place. Definitely later on he polished and improved it, but it was much in place by that time. And he even stated later on that the Old Testament portrayed a manifestly false history of the world. So in other words, for him, his model would not really fit into the Old Testament. So the Old Testament had to be disregarded. At the same time, in 1844, Karl Marx wrote his famous economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, also known as the Paris Manuscripts, proposing that, and I am just quoting from his own manuscript, that the more man puts into God, the less he retains for himself. In other words, God becomes an illusion, should be out of the picture. That very same year, as you know very well, in June 1844, Joseph Smith Jr. was imprisoned, and a few days later, he and his brother were assassinated. And that was not a good time to become a prophet. At the same time, the very same year, 1844, Bab, the founder of the Baha'i faith, and then, of course, the main leader became Baha'u'llah. But Bab claimed to have received a special revelation from God that he would be the prophet for the future. And if you would study a little bit the Baha'i faith, you will see that for them, the year 1844 is very meaningful, because that's the time when truth began to be restored. And once I went to the world headquarters in Haifa, Israel, and I asked the lady that was at the front desk, what does it mean? What does 1844 mean to you? And they said, well, it's the restoration of truth. That was the time when it began. Of course, we could add many more examples, but let me just highlight two more. It might be a simple coincidence, but don't forget that in 1844, Julius Wellhausen was born also, who became one of the top Old Testament critics by use of higher criticism or the historical critical method. And also Friedrich Nietzsche was born the very same year. And for Nietzsche, I have difficulties with his views. If you read some of his writings, and I would advise you not to do so. He claims that when he was 12 years of age, he had a better understanding of the Trinity. And this better understanding is that there was in heaven God Father, using his own language, God Son, and God Teufel, or God the devil. And he claims that this is the basis of his philosophical system. Or with this conclusion, he started to philosophize. No wonder that in his last book, and I don't know because there are variations of pronunciations of it, Ecce Homo, 1886, there he states, and I am quoting verbatim, "It was God himself who at the end of his day's work lay down as a serpent under the tree of knowledge. Thus, he rested from being God. He had made everything too beautiful. The devil is merely God's idleness on the seventh day." He died in the year 900, but his views shaped significantly Western culture to our days. And we have another example in 1888, and for you that know a little bit about our history as Adventists, that's the time of our, what I call Bible conferences, that help really to shape our message, although our pioneers already had some views on this matter of our doctrines. But this was the time really where they tried to encompass the former Millerites into the movement and to spread the message. At the same time, in Hydesville, New York, you had the beginning of modern spiritualism. It's interesting that later on these sisters, they denied the experience, and they said, no, it was just a game, we were just playing, they are having fun, and that was not the case. And when Ellen White identified this as the beginning of spiritualism, since they denied, Ellen White was in a bad shape in public opinion because it would not make sense. But later on, they said that they denied it just because they would not like to be blamed by public in general. But that really was the case. And if you go today, if you visit the place, you will see the cornerstone confirming that this is the birthplace of modern spiritualism. And the book, or the centennial book on the history of modern spiritualism, was published in 1948, and saying that this is the beginning. Ellen White says that spiritualism would spread and take over the world, basically. And at that time, she stated it. And today you have even books for children about the experience of the Fox sisters, saying that they should really be trained to become mediums and so on. And I believe, I am more and more convinced that Ellen White called Ellen Harmon, who later on became White, as a prophetic voice to keep us faithful to God and His abiding word in such a challenging world as we started just to describe. And let's go to the first one. The Great Controversy Framework. The Great Controversy has been described from different perspectives. Some people say that it is the center of our theology, or this is something else. And I like the word framework. I believe that nothing can replace God as the center of our theology. And in the unstable and unsafe world in which we live, many people are trying to understand the meaning of time, the flow of history, the purpose of life, and especially the problem of evil. As insightful as some attempts can be, I am more and more convinced that no other non-canonical author has ever developed those matters so perceptively as did Ellen White in the 5 volumes of her classical Conflict of the Ages series. Actually, the Great Controversy motif flows throughout her writings, providing the basic framework to understand reality in all its expressions. As I mentioned elsewhere, the Great Controversy is a currently ongoing cosmic conflict that had a beginning and will have an end. Its mysterious beginning in the heavenly courts was foreseen but not ordained by God, who made provision to meet the terrible emergency. After losing his gratitude to God and becoming increasingly jealous of him, Lucifer began to spread his apostasy in the heavenly courts. God, in his great mercy, bore long with Lucifer. But there came a time when he was expelled from heaven. And as you know, with the fall of Adam and Eve, this world became the battlefield between good and evil. But one question that comes, and after studying the current Sabbath School quarterly, is what distinguishes our view of the Great Controversy or of the cosmic controversy from other religions and Christian denominations that also believe in that kind of struggle between good and evil. And you have many of them, so it's not something unique for us. The unique element of the struggle is that center to this controversy is God's character as expressed in His law. And glimpsing through the Old Testament, and if you have the chance also to read Ellen White's Great Controversy Vision in Spiritual Gifts, Volume 1, or the 3rd part of Early Writings, that's a very faith-uplifting experience, because you see, with not so many details, that kind of conflict between good and evil very close to each other there. You will see that at the beginning, God tried to undermine God's law. And the temptation of God's people till the Babylonian exile was always idolatry. But then, after the exile, and the prophets really called attention that the problem was the transgression of God's law as well as the Sabbath. And then they said, now we will keep God's law so strongly and in such a way that no other captivity will show up. And then they went into legalism. The devil could not avoid the cross. So, after the cross, and it confirmed God's law, he tried to convince God's people that the very same instrument that confirmed the law abolished it. and try to convince Christians to believe in this kind of theory. God's end-time remnant people are placed on the special fury of Satan because they keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. The end-time preaching of the everlasting gospel to the whole world will polarize humanity eventually into those who worship the beast and his image and receive his mark on the forehead and the hand in one side, and those who keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus on the other side. Meanwhile, Satan tries to convince God's people that the requirements of Christ are less strict than they once believed, and by conformity to the world, they would exert a greater influence with worldlings. In other words, this is a quotation from Ellen White where she says that the devil's final strategy in the last days would be to try to convince us that we should not be so strict about what we thought about God's laws and his principles. But in his final attempts to deceive humanity, according to the book Great Controversy, Satan himself will personate Christ, and demons will personate the apostles of Christ, disclaiming the New Testament teachings. So we always focus basically on the devil trying to imitate or personify Christ. But Ellen White speaks also that demons will do the same with apostles, trying to say, well, what I wrote in the New Testament was so nice for that time, but today we live in a different world. So the challenge will be quite significant. No wonder that after the close of probation and prior to the second coming, God will vindicate his own law in a supernatural way. A heavenly hand will appear holding against the sky the two tables of stone with the precepts of the Decalogue so plainly written with a pen of fire that all can read them. Some people have the tendency to see that those would be the very same tables of stone from the Ark of the Covenant. Those were written by the finger of God, but here Ellen White speaks of written with a pen of fire, big enough so that all humanity can see those tables. And no wonder that also at the end of the millennium, during Christ's coronation, in the presence of all human beings and the demoniac hosts that ever existed, again Christ will hold in his hands the tables of the divine law, so that the wicked can see the commandments which they despised and transgressed. The pagan theory of natural immortality of the soul, accepted by most Christians today and many other religions, suggests that sin had a beginning but will never come to an end. So in other words, God is not powerful enough to end the history of sin. It had no reason to exist. I mean, it started without a reason. It exists without a reason, but there is no end to it. But according to the Bible and Ellen White, sin will have an end also. Right now, all humanity is involved in a great controversy between Christ and Satan regarding the character of God, his law, and his sovereignty over the universe. And according to Paul, we have been made spectacle to the whole world. It's interesting that this word in Greek is theatron, from where the word theater comes from. And universe, cosmos. Some say that we are just a spectacle to the world, but I think it's a little bit more than this, to angels and human beings as well. Ellen White says the world is a theater, the actors is inhabitants. Our little world is the lesson book of the universe. The whole universe is watching with inexpressible interest the closing scenes of the great controversy between good and evil. We will now go to another important topic, is in regard to the signs of the end. And this has generated some controversy in our ranks. I would like to mention as an introduction to it that some of the most significant moments in salvation history are preceded by earthquakes, cosmic signs in the sun, moon, and stars. For example, just before Christ offered his atoning sacrifice on the cross, the sun refused to shine. You remember this? And with any eclipse or other natural cause, there was complete darkness as midnight without moon and stars, Ellen White says. And shortly after, when he cried out, "It is finished," a mighty earthquake shook the ground, and many saints were raised up from the dead as witness of his divine power. Actually, an earthquake marked the hour when Jesus laid down his life, and another earthquake witnessed the moment when he took it up in triumph. Similar signs would occur also prior to Christ's glorious second coming. Seventh-day Adventists have seen those signs as already fulfilled in the Lisbon earthquake in November 1, 1755, the dark day of May 19, 1780, following by the night when the moon looked blood, and the meteor shower of November 13, 1833. But some scholars have questioned the validity of these identifications for being now too distant from the second coming. William Shea published an article in which he says that in the book of Revelation you have cosmic signs in different places, but the only place where you have this sequence, earthquake, sun, moon, and stars, is at the opening of the sixth seal. In The Desire of Ages, Ellen White relates the fulfillment of those cosmic signs with the end of the 1260 days of papal persecution, ending in 1798. And she states, at the close of the great papal persecution, Christ declared, the sun should be darkened, the moon should not give her light, next the stars should fall from heaven. And at the final edition, the standard edition of the Great Controversy in 1911, Ellen White kept the same identification. So it does not mean that that was an early identification and then later on she changed her view. No. In regard to this statement, this generation shall not pass till all those things will be fulfilled, Ellen White says, Christ has given signs of his coming. He declares that we may know when he is near, even at the door. He says to those who see these signs, this generation shall not pass till all these things will be fulfilled. According to the Sanctuary Review Committee of 1980, this quotation from Ellen White implies that these special signs were all to occur during the lifetime of a generation. So that's the way how the committee understood it. Does not mean that the second coming should be included, but the very same generation that sees the first of the signs should see other ones also. There is an obvious distinction in Ellen White's writings between the cosmic signs announcing the time of the end and the cosmic rearrangements for the pre-millennial second coming and for the post-millennial coming down of the New Jerusalem to this earth. Reading Ellen White, I came to this conclusion because sometimes we have the idea, the temptation either of picking up these signs and saying our pioneers were mistaken in identifying those as signs of the end, they should come close to the second coming, or that this is just a repetition. But I think it's far more than this. And we have a statement in Ellen White's vision of December 16, 1848. And I think that you were almost believing that there was no work for you to do. But this is a very important statement. See how the language is different from other ones. This is on.
The powers of heaven will be shaken at the voice of God. Then the sun, moon, and stars will be moved out of their places. They will not pass away, but be shaken by the voice of God. Dark, heavy clouds came up and clashed against each other. The atmosphere parted and rolled back. Then we could look up through the open space in Orion, whence came the voice of God. The holy city will come down through that open space.
So you see that Ellen White does not speak at the second coming of just another signs or darkening of the sun or this kind, but really a shaking of those elements, and also a great earthquake. And you know, in the great controversy, she described in very terrible words that there will be an overall global commotion and everything will be shaken. So I think that this will be a rearrangement in a catastrophic way of the universe of our cosmos, so that Christ's coming will take place, and also later on the New Jerusalem. Let's go to the fourth point or part, the conditional imminence. The New Testament speaks of a literal and visible second coming of Christ, that it would occur near and in not so near future. From the near perspective, Christ stated, for instance, that you will not have gone through the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes. There are some standing here who shall not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. And another expression, this generation will by no means pass away till all things take place. And surely I am coming quickly, and so on. And even Paul says, we who will be alive. Those are from a near perspective, but from a not so near perspective, Jesus adds that after seeing the signs, the cosmic signs mentioned in Matthew 24, but the end is not yet. And Paul says also that it would not take place prior to the great apostasy. As you heard in other presentations, Johannes Weiss and Albert Schweitzer suggested that Christ intended to return still in the apostolic era, but his plans were frustrated and consequently his coming was delayed. But this theory is loaded with serious theological implications. If this view is right, then we have to admit that Jesus made up a promise to his disciples that he did not keep. And more, if Jesus was mistaken about the central purpose of his own mission, then it's difficult also to understand how the other elements in his religious message remain trustworthy. But this is not the case. Ellen White tries to harmonize this tension between the establishment of the kingdom of grace and the kingdom of glory. So the kingdom was already there, but it would have his full geographical expression later on. Christ was neither mistaken nor ignorant about his own mission and establishment of his kingdom. As he foretold about his future death on the cross, Christ also warned his disciples that he would not return before all the expected signs would be fulfilled. And Ellen White explains when they ask the question, is this the time for you to restore the kingdom? Ellen White says that in Christ's eyes there were centuries of persecution, of trouble for the church. But in his mercy and love, he did not open up this kind of distinction. Did not solve this kind of centuries of trouble. Probably if he would have said, well, I would not come before 2,000 years, the disciples would not keep their faith and their commitment to fulfill the mission. And even Edward Gibbon puts the second coming, this kind of expectation of the soon coming of Christ as one of the reasons of all the power of the apostolic church. And what about the time element in regard to the second coming? Some people like to quote a statement by Ellen White where she says that like the stars in the vast circuit of the appointed path, God's purposes know no haste nor delay. But this is a statement that really is related to the first coming of Christ. In regard to the second coming, and I am skipping several lines and paragraphs here, Ellen White says that the second coming could not have come prior to 1798 at the end of the 1260 years. But she also speaks about the second coming after 1844 and 1888, crucial moments in our history when Christ could have come according to what she says, if the church would have fulfilled its mission. Since Christ did not return in any of those occasions, Mrs. White could speak of a delay of the second coming, even without having a specific date for the second coming. Thus, for Ellen White, God knows the time of the second coming, but that knowledge is quite dependent of human behavior. Does God know if I will be saved or lost? Yes, he knows. But I am still free to choose my future. And this is something very difficult for us to understand. There are a few statements here where Ellen White says, Christ's coming is nearer than when we believed. Every passing day leaves us on less to proclaim the message of warning to the world. Every day that passes brings us nearer to the end. Does it bring us also nearer to God? With this in mind, let's reflect a little bit on number 5. Well, this is just an illustration for you to have an idea. Some people ask, for how long will we continue to preach that Jesus is coming soon? And now, the end time scenario. Our appreciation of Ellen White's eschatological writings should be guided by some foundational principles. So I will not outline the final events because you have many attempts that try to do this, and probably the best one would be the book Last Day Events by Ellen White herself. So you have quite a sequence. But I would like to highlight 4 points that I think that can be useful for us. First, although the language used by Ellen White is occasionally time and place conditioned, the basic concepts carried over still are valid and relevant for us today. Some people are concerned because Ellen White was her writings culturally or historically conditioned. It always depends what you mean by cultural or historically conditioned. She used the language and the images of her time, and also described some events, probably in a conditional way. But I believe that the core of those statements are valid for us today. There are statements where she says, for instance, that swords will be used in our persecution. That might be the case, but she does not refer to modern guns that we have today and weapons and this kind of things. That was not a language available in those days. But overall picture, I think, that is coming to be is being fulfilled today, as we would expect. The second point, we should realize that our appreciation of Ellen White's end-time scenario is largely shaped by our hermeneutical lenses, how we see things. Jonathan Butler wrote in 1979 that Ellen White's predictions of the future appeared as projections of a screen, on a screen, which only enlarged, dramatized, and intensified the scenes of her contemporary world, characterized by a strong anti-Catholic spirit. And then in other place he says that her eschatology envisioned only the end of her world, not our world. So the world in which she was living. And of course, evidently, for Butler, he had a very critical approach to Ellen White's eschatology, saying that it did not make any sense. But for those who still believe that God exists, that he revealed himself through his prophets, and that Ellen White was a true canonical prophet, we can see that the picture really is different. Ellen White prophetic expositions shed light on the path and help us to better understand the overall flow of history. And one of the crucial statements that everybody here knows, but let's just glimpse through it again.
Through the two great errors, the immortality of the soul and Sunday sacredness, Satan will bring the people under his deceptions. While the former lays the foundation of spiritualism, the later creates a bond of sympathy with Rome. Protestantism will yet stretch her hand across the gulf to grasp the hand of spiritualism. She will reach over the abyss to clasp hands with the Roman power, and under the influence of this threefold union, our country will follow in the steps of Rome in trampling on the rights of conscience.
Elsewhere, Ellen White says that is not Catholicism that has changed, is the Protestant world that has changed significantly. And if we would take seriously what Butler said in regard to Ellen White be just a victim of her own environment or the world in which she lived, we would have difficulties really to understand what is going on in the world today. Our ecumenical movement today does not mean that the Roman Catholic Church will adjust itself to the other denominations. It means that the other denominations should go back to the mother church. And I quote a few documents here, time does not allow to go through them, but let me just highlight one of those. It's a document from the year 2000, Dominus Jesus, and in paragraph 17 we read the following.
Therefore there exists a single Church of Christ, which subsists in the Catholic Church, governed by the successor of Peter and by the bishops in communication with him. The churches which, while not existing in perfect communion with the Catholic Church, remain united to her by means of the closest bonds, that is, by apostolic succession and a valid Eucharist, are true particular churches. Therefore, the Church of Christ is present and operative also in these churches, even though they lack full communion with the Catholic Church, since they do not accept the Catholic doctrine of the primacy, which, according to the will of God, the Bishop of Rome objectively has and exercises over the entire Church.
You will see that some of the statements in regard to the Lutheran World Federation and the Roman Catholic Church also see more and more this attempt of having communion together. And some people even say there is no reason more to have a reformation or to protest. Why to protest? We are in a huge fellowship. I think that this is a fulfillment and making Ellen White's statement even more relevant today when we are seeing this kind of events taking place. Third point is we should emphasize the large picture of Ellen White's, avoiding falling into the newspaper approach of trying to see her writings as being fulfilled in every single event around us. We have had already too many little disappointments with this, when we try to pick up one point here, another one there, and so on, and later on the world scenario changes. But a broad picture, I think, is leading more and more towards this direction. And now we have two very significant statements not from Ellen White, but I think that we should take into consideration that tries to avoid us to become false prophets or prophets by ourselves.
In the exposition of unfulfilled prophecy, where the history is not written, the student should put forth his propositions with not too much positiveness, lest he find himself straying in the field of fancy. There are those who think more of the future truth than of the present truth. They see but little light in the path in which they walk, but they think they see great light ahead of them. James White. In regards to unfulfilled prophecy, there's always the danger for the interpreter to speculate or to subtly become a prophet himself. Gerhard Haase.
You have to be careful with this idea. We try to see how the prophecies will be fulfilled in the future, and we are not so sure, but I give my opinion as if this would be the case. A fourth point is that we should take into considerations all statements by Ellen White in a given point in regard to eschatology as well. And this can be very well illustrated by what has been considered or called the last generation theology. M. L. Andreessen proposed that God's remnant people will be fully vindicate God's character to the universe, before the universe, by living a life of sinless perfection. And now I am quoting from him. He states that perfection to which Paul said he had not attained will be finally reached by the 144,000. So Paul wasn't able to reach it, but we should. By contrast, those who argue against say, well, we will never reach sinless perfection till the resurrection and the second coming. And now many people today in our church are asking what Ellen White has to say on this matter. And I would like just to bring together two sides of the coin. I think that the problem is that many times we see one side and we forget the other one.
God is leading us.
What is going on?
God is leading us.
Better you stay with both. Maybe one of them will work.
God is leading out a people who are peculiar. He will cleanse and purify them and fit them for translation. Every carnal thing will be separated from God's peculiar treasures until they shall be like gold 7 times purified.
This is a very meaningful statement. So there is a growth. We should go towards God's ideal for our lives. But at the same time, you have on the other side this statement from Acts of the Apostles.
Sanctification is not the work of a moment, an hour, a day, but of a lifetime. It is not gained by a happy flight of feelings, but it is the result of constantly dying to sin and constantly living for Christ. So long as Satan reigns, we shall have self to subdue, besetting sins to overcome. So long as life shall last, there will be no stopping place, no point which we can reach and say, I have fully attained. Sanctification is the result of lifelong obedience. None of the apostles and prophets ever claimed to be without sin. Men who have lived the nearest to God, men who would sacrifice life itself rather than knowingly commit a wrong act, men whom God has honored with divine light and power, have confessed the sinfulness of their nature.
And let's go. Our time is running fast. And let's go to the last topic, is the victorious outcome. Why do some people have difficulties accepting a real heaven or a literal one? One of the reasons is if you believe that tangible things are only here and that here there are people that I can touch, there are desks, there is chairs and so on. But the other one is the spiritual world. Heaven will never make sense for them, for these people. But the biblical concept is different. It's not shaped by Greek philosophy or ideologies that you can add. Heaven is much more than the Elysium of Greek mythology or the utopic Shangri-La of James Hilton's novel, Lost Horizon from 1933. Indeed, heaven is as real as this world except for the presence of sin, and time does not deteriorate things in our own lives. And I would like to share with you, before we close, a few very meaningful statements by Ellen White that for me are like jewels in this matter.
The inheritance of the saved is called a country. There the heavenly shepherd leads his flock to fountains of living waters. The tree of life yields its fruit every month, and the leaves of the tree are for the service of the nations. There are ever-flowing streams, clear as crystal, and beside them waving trees cast their shadows upon the paths prepared for the ransomed of the Lord. There the wide-spreading plains swell into hills of beauty, and the mountains of God rear their lofty summits. On those peaceful plains, beside those living streams, God's people, so long pilgrims and wanderers, shall find a home.
Actually, heaven is not a place of loneliness or amnesia. There will be social life and family relationships also, in the sense of being together. And Ellen White says that little children will be brought back to the arms of their mothers, those children that died in an early age. Friends will be together, never to part again. And we will even remind and remember the past. Some people have this idea, no, there are nothing, we will not remember anything. Even the angel, our guardian angel, according to Ellen White, will remind us of some chapters of our life that were unknown, or things that God's intervention in special moments. But I think that when it says that there will be no remembrance of the past, it means that the remembrance of the past will not interfere in our joy and happiness forever. Because many will say, I was a sinner without God and without hope, But you came, preached to me, and now I'm here rejoicing in the Lord. So you can see immediately that there is some kind of remembrance from the past. But let's just glimpse through a few more statements here.
And what is the happiness of heaven but to see God? What greater joy could come to the sinner saved by the grace of Christ than to look upon the face of God and know him as Father?
Yes, you will see that the climax of salvation is finally the restoration of human beings to the very presence of God. Some people say, well, the Father will never be seen, but I think that the Bible is clear in this point, even Jesus' statement and Ellen White also. Can you imagine we, human beings, seeing the God, the Father? And the other one?
Heaven is worth everything to us. And if we lose heaven, we lose all.
Concluding remarks. This is a very meaningful statement that we should reflect as individuals on this one.
I saw that all heaven is interested in our salvation. And shall we be indifferent? Shall we be careless, as though it were a small matter whether we're saved or lost? Shall we slight the sacrifice that has been made for us? Some have done this. They have trifled with offered mercy, and the frown of God is upon them. God's Spirit will not always be grieved. It will depart if grieved a little longer. After all has been done that God could do to save men, if they show by their lives that they slight Jesus' offered mercy, death will be their portion, and it will be dearly purchased. It will be a dreadful death, for they will have to feel the agony that Christ felt upon the cross to purchase for them the redemption which they have refused. And they will then realize what they have lost, eternal life and the immortal inheritance. The great sacrifice that has been made to save souls shows us their worth. When the precious soul is once lost, it is lost forever.
We have to preach the gospel to the world, but to ourselves as well, because our first mission field is our own life and mind. Some people say that Ellen White preached a theology of fear, or Theologie der Angst. See what Ellen White wrote prior to 1888.
Live the life of faith day by day. Do not become anxious and distressed about the time of trouble, and thus have a time of trouble beforehand. Do not keep thinking, I am afraid I shall not stand in the great testing day. You are to live for the present, for this day only. Tomorrow is not yours. Today you are to maintain the victory over self. Today you are to live a life of prayer. Today you are to fight the good fight of faith. Today you are to believe that God blesses you. And as you gain the victory over darkness and unbelief, you will meet the requirements of the Master and will become a blessing to those around you.
So we should not have a time of trouble today. Let it arrive whenever it wants. What we need is to live with Christ. As Richard Lehman taught me once, we should not prepare ourselves for the second coming. We should be prepared, because we have the tendency of postponing. I had two more statements here, and the time is up. Let's just read one of those and then a final one.
How can a Christian sleep in such an age as we are now living in? Knowledge is increased, and the faculties are increased for attaining great results for God and humanity. Then we see so many harvest fields of labor opening before us, inviting those of strong faith and hope and courage to enter them. To sleep now is a fearful crime. The Lord is coming. We are appointed to prepare the way for his coming by acting our part to prepare a people to stand in that great day. Is there one Christian whose pulse does not beat with the quickened action as he anticipates the great events already opening before us? we hear the footsteps of an approaching God to punish the world for their iniquity. We should watch and work and pray as though this were the last day that would be granted us. How intensely earnest, then, would be our life. How closely would we follow Jesus in all our words and deeds.
More than just knowing about the final events and so much about eschatology, may the Lord bless us the chance, the opportunity, the blessing of standing at that great day and then live with the Lord and all the saints forever. Amen.